"I can make her walk again," said the boy. No one noticed him at first. He was barefoot, quiet, and thin, almost like a shadow among the busy streets of Philadelphia. But when he stood in front of billionaire Richard Blake and his paralyzed daughter, everything in the world seemed to stop. Richard had spent millions on top-tier doctors, therapies, global specialists. All of them said the same thing: there was no hope. His daughter Sarah would never walk again. But this boy didn't speak like a con artist. He didn't beg. He didn't ask for money. He simply looked Richard in the eye and said it again. "I can make her walk." Who was this child? And more importantly, what did he know that no one else did? Because in the next few days, Richard Blake would discover that miracles don't always wear white coats. Sometimes they come barefoot, covered in dust, holding nothing but a stone and an unshakable belief. Freedom. Plaza buzzed with life. The sounds of guitar strings danced in the air. Children laughed around fountains. Food vendors shouted over. The scent of sweet pretzels and roasted corn. But in the middle of it all, Richard Blake sat quietly on a bench watching the world pass by. His phone lay untouched. His watch gleamed in the sunlight, but none of it mattered. Beside him, Sarah, his 9-year-old daughter, sat motionless in her custom wheelchair. Her eyes were vacant, her soul even more so. Since the car crash, she hadn't taken a single step. And worse, she hadn't smiled. Richard had tried everything. He had flown her across the globe, consulted world-class surgeons, paid for futuristic treatments. Nothing worked. They all gave the same sterile, devastating answer. She would never walk again. So when a barefoot boy appeared in front of them, it felt like an interruption. "Sir, I can help your daughter walk again." Richard blinked, startled. "What?" "I just need your permission." The boy's tone wasn't desperate. It was firm, calm, confident. His name wasn't offered. His appearance said nothing about power, but his voice carried weight. Sarah turned to her father. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it pierced everything. "Dad, can we try?" It was the first time she'd asked for anything in weeks, and for reasons Richard couldn't explain, he said yes. 1 hour. They found a quiet corner beneath a flowering jacaranda tree. The boy, still nameless, pulled out a frayed cloth and smoothed it on the ground. From his pockets, he arranged tiny pebbles and twigs into a strange circular pattern, slow and careful, as though the design itself held meaning. Sarah watched, wide-eyed. Richard stood nearby, skeptical, but unable to walk away. Then the boy handed Sarah a smooth black stone. "Hold this." "What is it?" Richard asked, crossing his arms. "It's not magic," the boy said. "It's memory. She needs to remember walking, not with her legs, but in her mind." He knelt before Sarah and met her gaze. "Close. Your eyes," he whispered. "Feel the wind in your hair. Feel the grass beneath your feet. Remember what it feels like to run." Richard wanted to protest. This wasn't science. It wasn't medicine. It was nonsense. But before he could speak, Sarah gasped. Her small hands trembled around the stone. "I feel something," she whispered. "It's like a ripple, under the surface." Tears pooled at the corners of her eyes, uncertain but real. She stared at her legs, still lifeless, unmoving, but looked at them with something new. Not sadness. Focus. Hope. Richard's breath caught in his chest. He had seen her legs frozen 1,000 times. But never like this. Never with her mind so alive. He didn't know what the boy was doing. But for the first time in 2 years, he wanted to believe. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. Something about the boy gnawed at his mind. Who was he? Where did he learn that strange technique? And how could a child with nothing command so much presence? By dawn, Richard made a call. He had connections, private investigators who owed him favors. "I want a background check," he ordered. "A boy, maybe 8 or 9. Kensington area. Might go by Micah." What came back chilled him to the bone. Micah Jameson wasn't just a street kid. His real name was Micah Arrieta. 3 years ago, he survived a car crash. A crash caused by a drunk driver employed by none other than Blake Logistics, Richard's own company. The settlement had been swift and quiet. The media had been paid to look away. No one ever asked what happened to the child who survived. Now, Richard knew. Micah hadn't come with a lawsuit. He hadn't come with anger. He came with healing, and it terrified Richard. He followed the trail to a place in Kensington, a weathered shack with a handwritten sign, Dr. Harold Amos. Free. Rehab. No promises. Just gratitude. Inside, a gray-haired man with a limp greeted him. "You're Richard Blake," the doctor said. "Micah said you'd come." Dr. Amos explained everything. After the crash, Micah was left abandoned, paralyzed. But he fought, day by day, until he walked again. He healed himself, the doctor said, handing Richard a notebook. "I just showed him how to believe." Richard left, clutching that notebook like a sacred scroll. He thought he had hired the world's best, but the real miracle had been hiding in the shadows of his own past. Continues in next response. Section 4 to 8. Continuing from where we left off, here are sections 4 through 8, each around 300 words, maintaining emotional depth, smooth narrative flow, and high retention for text-to-speech AI storytelling. Back at the mansion, Richard paced the hallway for nearly an hour before calling his housekeeper. "Prepare a room," he said. "Micah's staying." Janet, the head of staff, frowned. "With all due respect, sir, he's not trained. He's a child, unsupervised." But Richard didn't care. Sarah had smiled yesterday. Actually smiled. That was more progress than 2 years of medicine had achieved. He led Micah into the greenhouse, once a room for exotic orchids, now empty. "You'll set up here," Richard said. Micah didn't question. He simply nodded. The next morning, Sarah wheeled herself in. Her eyes brightened as she saw Micah already laying out ropes, small weights, and cloth balls filled with rice. "What's all this?" she asked. "It's how we train your mind to remember movement," he said. "Your legs don't lead. Your belief does." Each day became a ritual. They played games that disguised therapy, balancing, tossing weighted balls, visualizing movement, with music and rhythm. And every time Sarah faltered, Micah repeated the same phrase. "Not yet, but close," Richard observed from the shadows, unsure whether he was watching therapy or something deeper, something spiritual. But then, one rainy morning, Sarah cried out in pain. Micah dropped everything and ran to her side. Janet stormed in. "This ends." "Now!" She called Dr. Crane, a trusted physician. He examined Sarah and shook his head. "No more of this nonsense. It's reckless." Richard stood torn between the expert and the barefoot boy. Then Sarah gripped his hand. "Don't send him." "Away," she whispered. "Please, Dad. He's helping me." Her voice cracked, but her spirit didn't. Richard looked between his daughter and Micah. Then slowly, he nodded. "2 more weeks," he said. "Show me progress, or it ends." Micah simply nodded. That was all he needed. The mansions. Mood shifted. Dr. Crane stayed, wary but intrigued. He offered traditional therapy. Micah insisted on mind-body work. Together they formed an uneasy alliance, science and belief dancing a quiet truce. Sarah, for her part, fought harder than ever. Every morning started with breathing exercises, then balance drills, then long visualizations, where she'd close her eyes and whisper, "I'm walking, I'm walking." Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she wanted to quit. But Micah never pushed too hard. He'd sit beside her, calm as ever, and remind her, "One more try." The black stone stayed in her pocket now. She clutched it during every session, as if it had become a piece of her. Richard watched from the hallway windows. He saw the sweat, the frustration, the small tremors in Sarah's legs, the moments where her toes twitched ever so slightly. Dr. Crane began taking notes. Quietly, privately. At night, Richard would visit Sarah's room. They would talk, not as father and patient, but as two people finally beginning to heal. "You really believe he's helping?" Richard asked one night. Sarah nodded. "It's not just my body, it's like I'm remembering who I am." And Richard, once a man who only believed in contracts and certainty, began to wonder if faith really could bend fate. As the final day of the 2-week deadline approached, everyone held their breath. The staff whispered. Janet stayed silent. Dr. Crane remained neutral. And Micah? He just kept showing up, barefoot, dusty, focused. The clock was ticking, but something far more important had already started. Sarah was beginning to believe in herself again. The living room had never been so still. Janet stood near the piano. Dr. Crane hovered beside the fireplace. Richard sat forward in his chair, hands clasped so tight his knuckles had turned white. Micah stood beside Sarah's wheelchair. "You ready?" Sarah nodded. Micah gently guided her forward, helping her place both feet on the mat. Her hands gripped, the rails on either side. Her breath was steady. Silence. Then, with a tremble, Sarah pulled herself up. 1 second. 2. 3. Gasps filled the room. Richard stood suddenly. A sound caught in his throat. Sarah's body wobbled, but she didn't fall. Her eyes stayed focused forward. When she finally sank back into her chair, it was not with defeat, but triumph. She looked around the room, her cheeks flushed, her smile wide. "I did it." Richard dropped to his knees, tears spilling from his eyes. He couldn't remember the last time he'd cried. Dr. Crane removed his glasses, stunned, speechless. Even Janet covered her mouth. That night, Richard did something he had never done before. He invited every servant, every staff member to the dining hall. Sarah sat at the center, glowing with pride. "My daughter walked today," Richard said, lifting his glass. "Not because of science, but because of a boy who never stopped believing in her." Micah sat quietly beside Sarah. He didn't need applause. The victory wasn't his. It was hers. Later that night, Micah returned to the room in the greenhouse. It was quiet, peaceful, but something was different. On the bed lay a thick envelope, sealed and heavy. His name was written across the front in careful script. Micah opened it slowly. Inside were legal papers, real ones, bearing the state seal and the signature of Richard Blake, adoption papers. Micah blinked, reading the same lines again and again. It didn't feel real. Then the door creaked open. Richard stood in the doorway, eyes soft, voice low. "You gave my daughter more than strength. You gave her life." Micah's lips trembled. He didn't know what to say. "I want to give you something too," Richard said. "A home, a future, a family. One where you never have to fight alone again." Micah nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Then Sarah burst through the door, throwing her arms around him. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The embrace said it all. "You belong here." Richard watched from the doorway, a fullness in his chest. He hadn't felt since Sarah was born, in a world where everything had been about numbers, balance sheets, and profit. He had finally found something real, something priceless, a son. The truth still lingered in the air. Micah had never spoken about the accident, never asked why it happened, never blamed Richard for the choices that led to it. But Richard knew, he knew the boy had once been forgotten by a world built on money and reputation. One evening, he asked gently, "Micah, do you know who was responsible?" Micah looked up, his eyes quiet but clear. "Yes." Richard waited, but Micah said nothing else. "You came for revenge?" he asked. Micah shook his head. "I came to help her walk." Richard felt something crumble inside him. The shame, the guilt, the belief that he didn't deserve forgiveness. But Micah had already offered something better than forgiveness. He had offered grace. That week, Richard funded the creation of a new rehab center, the Arietta House, in honor of the boy who taught him that faith is sometimes more powerful than fact. Sarah visited the center weekly, now able to take steps on her own. And Micah? He was no longer just a miracle. He was family. Because sometimes the greatest healing doesn't come from medicine. It comes from being seen, from being believed in, and from knowing that no matter how broken the past was, the future is still yours to shape.